Al Capone was afraid of one man, not the FBI. He owned half the agents in Chicago, not the police. They were on his payroll, not rival Italian gangs. He wiped them out on Valentine's Day, and he didn't lose a night's sleep. Al Capone was the man who ordered the massacre of 7 men in a garage. He beat 2 associates to death with a baseball bat at a dinner party while the other guests watched. He controlled every square inch of Chicago and had judges, senators, and police chiefs eating out of his hand. Yet he looked at the South Side and decided he was not going over there. Because on the South Side of Chicago, there was a black man who had made it very clear what would happen to anyone, Italian, Irish, or otherwise, who tried to take what was his. That man carried a loaded revolver every single day of his adult life. He had a temper that went from 0 to gunfire in a heartbeat. He shot men in the street and walked away while they bled out on the pavement. He beat collectors unconscious with his bare hands for shortchanging his customers. He had a crew of off-duty police officers who worked as his personal bodyguards, not because he was scared, but because the bodies were starting to attract attention. And when word reached him that Capone's men were asking questions about the South Side, about the money, the operation, the territory, Rowe sent back a message that every Italian in Chicago understood. Come and take it. See what happens. They didn't come. Not while Capone was alive, not for nearly 20 years. Because Al Capone, the most violent gangster in American history, did the math. He looked at what this man had done to people who crossed him. He looked at the loyalty this man commanded from an entire community. He looked at the bodies, and Capone made the only smart decision of his career. He left Teddy Rowe alone. Theodore Teddy Rowe, born to a sharecropper. He never spent a day in school. He taught himself to read, to fight, to sew a suit, and to shoot a man between the eyes. He built a $1 million empire from nickels and dimes. He killed a made man of the Italian mafia with his bare hands and beat the murder charge. He was offered $250,000 to walk away, and he said, "If I'm going down, I'm going down like a man. I don't run." And 20 years after they finally killed him, 20 years later, the mob boss who ordered the hit was caught on an FBI wiretap saying, "I'll say this, black or no black, that bastard went out like a man. He had balls." That was the only time in the history of the Italian mafia that a boss admitted on tape, in his own words, that a black man was tougher than his entire organization. This is the story of Teddy Rowe. And it's the most dangerous story in Chicago history that nobody ever told you. So who was Teddy Rowe? To understand what Teddy Rowe did, you have to understand who he was. Because this was not a man who stumbled into greatness. This was a man who was built for war from the day he was born. He came into the world on August 26, 1898, in Galliano, Louisiana, deep in the bayou, about as far from power as a human being could get. His father was a sharecropper. That meant he worked someone else's land, paid rent with a portion of the harvest, and stayed poor no matter what he did. It was legal slavery with a receipt. Rowe was raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. He never received a single day of formal education. Not one. Everything he ever learned, he taught himself or learned on the street. He was self-taught. As a boy, he worked for a tailor, running errands and learning to sew. That skill would follow him his entire life. Years later, when he was the most powerful black racketeer in Chicago, when he had a wardrobe that made movie stars jealous, people would ask where he got his suits made. He made them himself. The man could sew a suit by hand, and shoot a mafia enforcer in the face on the same day. And he had another quality that set him apart from almost every other black man in his era. Teddy Rowe could pass for white. His complexion was light enough that, in certain rooms, certain settings, people assumed he was Italian or Mediterranean or anything other than what he was. In Jim Crow America, that ability was a weapon. It gave him access to places, information, and conversations that no one expected a black man to hear. By his early 20s, Rowe was bootlegging. He was making money, building a reputation as a man who was reliable, tough, and not to be trifled with. When he married Carrie in 1923, he tried to go straight. He moved to Detroit and worked in an automobile plant. But the job did not last. He was laid off. With no money, no prospects, and no education, Rowe did what millions of black Americans had done before him, and he headed for Chicago. He arrived on the South Side in the late 1920s, and he walked into a world that would make him a king. Why Al Capone stayed away. In the 1930s, on the South Side of Chicago, in the neighborhood called Bronzeville, there was an underground economy that was bigger than most legitimate businesses in the city. It was called the policy game, a street lottery. You paid a nickel and you picked your numbers. If your numbers hit, you got paid. It was illegal, it was wildly popular, and it generated millions of dollars every single year. The men who ran the policy wheels were called the Policy Kings. In an era when segregation locked black Americans out of banks, out of business loans, and out of the legitimate economy entirely, the Policy Kings were the community. They were the employers. They were the banks. They were the ones who funded churches, opened department stores, paid for funerals, and kept the South Side alive. The famous writer Richard Wright once said of them, they would have been steel tycoons, Wall Street brokers, and auto moguls had they been white. Rowe started at the bottom. He was hired as a runner, a salesman who walked the streets collecting bets. But his boss, the biggest policy king in Chicago, saw something in him immediately. Not just intelligence, not just loyalty, controlled, purposeful, terrifying violence. Rowe became the enforcer first, the fixer, the man they sent when a rival wheel was stealing customers, the man they sent when a collector was skimming, the man they sent when somebody needed to understand, physically, painfully, permanently, that the South Side had rules, and those rules were not suggestions. He climbed from runner to enforcer, to lieutenant to partner. And by the time he reached the top, every hustler, every bookie, every street operator on the South Side knew two things about Teddy Rowe. He would give you the shirt off his back if you were in need, and he would put you in the ground if you crossed him. There were stories, the kind of stories that do not make the newspapers, but travel through neighborhoods like electricity through a wire. Stories about what happened to men who tried to cheat Rowe's operation. Stories about men who had walked into meetings with Rowe confident and walked out missing teeth, or did not walk out at all. Stories about a man who always had a revolver on his body, who had a fuse shorter than a match, and who had proven more than once that he was willing to use both. By the mid-1940s, the policy game on the South Side was generating over $25 million a year. And Teddy Rowe had become a policy king himself, running his own wheels, commanding his own territory, building his own empire inside the empire. Now here is the part that most people don't know. The part that tells you everything about how dangerous Teddy Rowe really was. Al Capone knew about the policy game. Of course he did. Capone controlled Chicago. He controlled the police, the politicians, the judges, the unions, the bootlegging, the gambling, everything. His organization, the Chicago Outfit, was the most powerful criminal enterprise in America. Capone had taken over the North Side by machine gunning 7 men in a garage. He had taken over Cicero by sending 200 armed men into the streets on Election Day. He had taken over the labor unions by bombing businesses that refused to comply. Al Capone did not ask permission. Al Capone took what he wanted, from everyone, except the South Side. Capone sent scouts into the Black Belt. They came back with reports, and the reports all said the same thing. The men who ran the policy game were not soft. They were not businessmen pretending to be tough. They were armed, organized, deeply embedded in a community that would die for them, and led by a man, Teddy Rowe, who had a reputation for settling disputes with a pistol, not a handshake. Capone's men had seen what happened to people who tried to muscle in on Rowe's territory. They had heard what Rowe did to collectors who betrayed him. They knew that Rowe's crew included off-duty Chicago police officers who were loyal to him, not to the department. And they knew that starting a war on the South Side meant fighting in neighborhoods where every face was hostile, every alley was a trap, and the man at the top would rather die shooting than surrender a single dollar. So Capone did something he almost never did. He backed off. His men would stay out of the South Side. The policy racket belonged to the black community. In exchange, the policy kings would stay out of the beer and liquor business. Capone controlled booze. The kings controlled numbers. Each side stayed in its lane. But make no mistake about what that deal really was. That wasn't a partnership between equals. That wasn't diplomacy. That was Al Capone, the most feared man in America, looking at Teddy Rowe and deciding that the cost of war was too high, that the man on the other side of that line was too dangerous, that the South Side of Chicago was the one place in the city where the Italian mafia could not simply walk in and take over. That deal held for nearly 20 years, through Capone's reign, through his imprisonment, through the transition of power to the men who came after him. For 2 decades, the South Side of Chicago was the one piece of territory that the Italian mafia did not control. And then Capone was gone, and the new generation, younger, hungrier, and stupid enough to think they were tougher than the men who came before them, decided to break the old deal. They had no idea what they were walking into. The man in the mirror fireplace. Before we get to the war, you need to understand how Teddy Rowe carried himself. This was not just a gangster. This was a man who turned himself into an institution. By the mid-1940s, Rowe was one of the most recognizable figures on the South Side. He wore custom-made suits he had personally tailored because the sharecropper's son, who learned to sew as a child, never lost the skill. He wore monogrammed silk shirts, alligator shoes, painted ties, wide-brimmed hats tilted at an angle that said, "I know exactly who I am." He spent $50,000 decorating his apartment on South Michigan Avenue. The living room had a fireplace made entirely of mirrors, floor to ceiling, every surface reflecting light. He had a 6-foot television set, enormous for the era, mounted on a turntable so he could rotate it to any angle in the room by pressing a single button. In the 1940s, most people did not even have television. Teddy Rowe had a rotating one, but the style was only the surface. Underneath, Rowe operated with a code that made him beloved in the community and feared on the streets. He earned the nickname Robin Hood, and it was no joke. He paid hospital bills for newborn babies whose families could not afford the cost. He paid funeral expenses for the dead when their relatives had nothing. He loaned money to his own employees and then forgave the debts. When an elderly woman played the numbers on a rival wheel and the operators refused to pay her winnings, Rowe went over there personally with some of his men and persuaded them to pay what they owed. Nobody cheated a customer on Teddy Rowe's South Side. He was the unofficial referee of the policy game, the Supreme Court of the streets. If there was a dispute, Rowe settled it. If there was injustice, Rowe corrected it. He ran his operation with a fairness that legitimate businesses could not match, because in the policy game, your reputation was your currency, and Rowe's reputation was flawless. But do not let any of that fool you into thinking he was soft. Teddy Rowe had a hair-trigger temper. He was good with his fists. He was better with a gun. He was always armed, always, and everyone who knew him understood that he was not a man who bluffed. When he said something, he meant it. When he made a threat, it was a promise. And when someone came at him, he came back harder. That combination, the silk shirts and the loaded revolver, the hospital bills and the hair-trigger temper, the mirror fireplace and the willingness to kill, is what made Teddy Rowe untouchable for as long as he lived. In 1946, the Italian Mafia made its move. The new leadership of the Chicago outfit had looked at the numbers. $25 million a year flowed through the South Side. Pennies and nickels from the poorest people in Chicago added up to a fortune. All of it was controlled by black men with no protection from the outfit, no political allies powerful enough to stop a takeover, and no military force that could match the full weight of the Italian Mafia. The boss sent his most ambitious soldier, the young killer who had learned about the policy game while sharing a prison cell with a policy king who had foolishly trusted him. He had pumped his cellmate for every detail, the money, the structure, the operations, the weaknesses, and now he had the backing of the entire organization. The first move was a kidnapping. They snatched the biggest policy king in Chicago, grabbed him off the street, and held him for 5 days with tape over his eyes and cotton in his ears. The ransom was $100,000 in cash and a promise to hand over the entire policy operation. Teddy Rowe paid the ransom. His boss was released, but the message was clear. The outfit was taking over. Pay the street tax, hand over control, or die. This is where the story splits. This is where one man's decision changed everything. The policy king who had been kidnapped took his money and fled to Mexico. His brother went with him. They were never heard from in Chicago again. Then, one by one, every other major policy operator on the South Side made the same choice. Some paid the tax, some handed over their wheels, some simply vanished, packed a bag in the middle of the night, and drove until they hit a state line. The outfit was too powerful. The violence was too extreme. The message was too clear. Within months, practically every black numbers operator in Chicago had either surrendered or disappeared. Every single one, except Teddy Rowe. When the outfit came to him with the same demand, pay the tax, hand over control, or face the consequences, Rowe did not negotiate. He did not ask for terms. He did not stall for time. He said no, flat, final, absolute. And then he did not run. He did not hide. He did not leave Chicago. He took over everything. Every wheel that the fleeing policy kings had abandoned, Rowe absorbed. Every territory they had left behind, Rowe claimed. Every customer who had lost their operator, Rowe served. He did not shrink. He expanded. At the exact moment when the Italian Mafia was trying to crush the black policy game, Teddy Rowe became bigger than he had ever been. His operation was pulling in over $1 million a year, all of it in pennies, nickels, and dimes. All of it from the same South Side neighborhoods that the outfit was trying to control. Rowe ran every cent of it with his name on it, daring them to come take it. They came. The outfit sent enforcers into the black wards. They bombed Roe's house. They fired shots at his wife and children. They beat up his collectors on the street. They took over gambling parlors. They set up their own bookie joints in taverns, barber shops, even church parking lots, anywhere they could plant a flag in territory that had belonged to black operators for decades. In 6 months, 12 Italian mob soldiers and an unknown number of Roe's men turned up dead on Chicago's streets and in its back alleys. This was a full-scale gang war, the most powerful criminal organization in America against one black man and his crew. And Roe was holding the line. Now the Italians understood why Al Capone had stayed away. Now they understood what the old boss had seen and calculated when he looked at the South Side and decided it was not worth the blood. Capone had been smart enough to respect the danger. These younger men had been arrogant enough to ignore it. They were paying for that arrogance in body bags. Every time they hit him, he hit back. Every time they took a parlor, he took one back. Every time they sent a message, he sent a louder one. His survival alone was an act of defiance. The fact that he was still alive, still operating, still collecting bets and paying winners, that was a humiliation for the outfit. They had the entire Chicago underworld under their control. They had hundreds of soldiers, they had police captains, aldermen, judges, and they couldn't break one man. The black community rallied behind Roe like he was a general in a war, because that's exactly what he was. People started placing their bets with Roe, specifically because he was fighting. Gambling with Teddy Roe became an act of resistance. His business didn't shrink during the war, it grew. The more the outfit attacked him, the more customers he attracted. The South Side was voting with its nickels. Finally, the outfit's top boss tried a different approach. He sat down with Roe personally. No soldiers, no threats, just 2 men in a room. The boss offered Roe $250,000 in cash, an astronomical sum, enough to retire, enough to disappear, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. The deal was simple. Take the money and walk away. Quit the policy rackets. Let the outfit have the South Side. Roe didn't flinch. He didn't think about it. He didn't ask for a day to consider. He looked the most dangerous man in Chicago in the eye and said he would die first. If he was going down, he would go down like a man. He said he did not run, and he told the boss to remember that. The boss leaned back and said, "Well, buddy boy, you just might." After that meeting, Roe told reporters, pounding his chest with his fist, that they would have to kill him to take him. He was not performing. He was not posturing. This was the same man who had made Al Capone think twice. The same man who had left bodies in alleys and walked home to press his suit for the next morning. The same man who had been settling disputes with a revolver since before these young Italian soldiers were old enough to hold a gun. He was making a statement of fact, and the Italian mafia, for the first time in their history, was dealing with a man who meant every word. In the summer of 1951, the outfit sent a crew to kidnap Teddy Roe. Not to kill him, to kidnap him the way they had kidnapped his old boss years earlier. Grab him, hold him, squeeze him until he broke. The crew was led by a made man, a full member of the Italian mafia, sworn in with blood and oaths. He was a soldier, an enforcer, a killer who had been doing the outfit's dirty work for years. He was also the brother of one of the outfit's most feared captains. This was not a low-level thug. This was someone who was supposed to be untouchable. They set up along a South Side street and flagged Roe's car down, pretending to be police officers. Roe pulled over. He demanded identification. Before he could process what was happening, they jumped him. But Teddy Roe was always armed, and Teddy Roe did not freeze. A fight broke out between Roe and the made man. Punches, grappling, and then a gunshot. Rowe pulled his pistol and fired. The made man dropped with a bullet through his head, dead on the street. Another attacker took a round in the shoulder. The rest of the crew scrambled into their car and fled. Think about what just happened. In 1951, in Jim Crow America, in a city controlled by the Italian mafia, in a neighborhood where the police worked for the outfit, a black man had just shot and killed a made member of the Chicago mob in a street gunfight, in broad daylight, and walked away alive. In the entire history of organized crime in America, made men were untouchable. Killing one was a declaration of war against the entire organization. It had almost never happened, and when it did, the person responsible usually ended up in a ditch within 48 hours. Teddy Rowe ended up in a courtroom, charged with murder. His lawyers argued self-defense. They were able to prove connections between prosecutors and the mob, causing key evidence to be thrown out. He was denied bail 6 times before and during the trial. The jury acquitted him. When word spread through the South Side that Teddy Rowe killed an Italian-made man and beat the case, he transcended gangster status. He became something larger, a symbol, proof that a black man could stand up to the most powerful criminal organization in America and not just survive, but win. A Chicago police detective who transported Rowe to court later told his son that the people of the neighborhood loved Rowe. He was like a Robin Hood to them. He was respected because he refused to give in to the Italians. You know how they say a crook with honor? That describes Rowe. After the killing, the outfit launched a brutal campaign of revenge against every black bookmaker in Chicago. Dozens were shot at, beaten, or driven out of the city permanently. The message was clear. This is what happens when you associate with Teddy Rowe. Rowe retreated to his mansion on South Michigan Avenue. He hired bodyguards, off-duty police officers, armed men, a small army stationed around his home at all times. For months, he did not leave. He ran his operation from behind fortified walls, protected by guns and loyalty, waiting for whatever came next. On August 1st, 1952, what came next was not a bullet. Doctors told him he had inoperable stomach cancer. Terminal. He was dying, not from the outfit, not from a shotgun, from a disease that no amount of money or firepower could stop. And Teddy Rowe made one final decision. He sent his bodyguards home, every single one. He dismissed the entire security detail. He did not need them anymore. He was going to die on his own terms, not behind walls, not surrounded by guards, not hiding. 3 days later, on the evening of August 4th, 1952, Theodore Teddy Rowe put on a 3-piece suit, a pressed shirt, and a hat, the same way he had dressed every day of his adult life. The sharecropper's son, who had taught himself to sew, who had built a $1 million empire from nickels, who had killed a made man with his own hands and beaten the charge, he dressed himself one last time like the king he was. He told his wife Carrie he was going out. He walked out the front door of 5239 South Michigan Avenue. Mafia hitmen were already parked on the street. They had been watching, waiting. As Rowe approached his car, someone called his name, Rowe. He turned. 5 blasts from 2 12-gauge shotguns hit him in the back, the jaw, and the face. He never had a chance to pull his revolver. He died, slumped against a tree on the sidewalk outside his own home. He was 53 years old. His wife heard the gunshots. She screamed his name. No answer. She opened the door and found him in a pool of blood on the pavement. The next morning, the Chicago newspapers reported that the king is dead. Teddy Rowe was laid out in a casket that cost $5,000. In 1952, that was more than most families earned in a year. His funeral was the largest for any black person in Chicago since Jack Johnson, the first African-American world heavyweight boxing champion, had died in 1946. Over 6,000 people came to the church on Wabash Avenue. Thousands more lined the streets outside. 81 cars followed the hearse in a funeral procession that stretched for blocks through the South Side. People wept openly. Strangers held each other. The entire community stopped to mourn a man who had done what no one else had dared to do. The minister stood before the mourners and said, "He was a friend of man, and he had a pure heart." No one was ever charged with his murder. Police questioned a dozen high-ranking members of the Italian mafia, including the very men who had orchestrated the takeover of the policy game. But no charges were filed. No trial. No justice. The outfit had won. After Roe's death, the Italian mafia seized complete control of the South Side policy racket. Within a few years, the numbers game became their most profitable operation, bringing in $150 million per year. The money that had once flowed through black-owned businesses, employed black workers, and funded black institutions was now in Italian hands. The economic backbone of the South Side was broken. The community that Teddy Roe had fought to protect was dismantled, not by the police, not by the government, but by the same men who had come for Roe and found one man standing in their way for 6 years while every other man in the city ran. And 20 years later, on a federal wiretap, the boss who had ordered Roe's murder said words that proved, even in death, even after 2 decades, Teddy Roe had earned the one thing the Italian mafia almost never gave anyone: respect. I'll say this, black or no black, that bastard went out like a man. He had balls. That was Teddy Roe, the boy who never went to school, the bootlegger who taught himself to sew, the Robin Hood who paid for funerals and hospital bills, the policy king who killed a made man with his bare hands and beat the murder charge, the man who was offered $250,000 to walk away and said, "I'll die first," the man who learned he was dying of cancer, sent his guards home, put on a 3-piece suit, and walked out the front door one last time. They killed him, but they never broke him, and the South Side of Chicago never forgot his name.